In just a few weeks, Canadians will head to the polls in what might be the most important election of our time. This isn't just a choice between left and right, it's a choice about the future of Canada, our economy, the housing market, our climate, and even how we see ourselves on the world stage. So, whether you're fed up, fired up, or just feeling indifferent about the whole thing, this election will affect you. So, let's break down what's at stake, who's vying for power, and why this moment might define the next decade. Canada is at a crossroads right now. You can ask anyone. Ask your neighbor, ask your friends, ask your barista at Starbucks. Chances are they'll all say the same thing. Something just doesn't feel right. Housing is unaffordable, groceries are sky high, and many young people feel like they're falling further behind no matter how hard they work. Add into that how global trade policy has never been in a more fragile state than it is right now. So, this isn't just another election cycle. This is a moment where the choices we could make could shape the direction of Canada for the next generation. We're dealing with historically low economic growth, historically high immigration targets, deepening divisions between the East and West provinces, and a growing sense that the country's political system just isn't delivering anymore. The trust between Canadians and their leaders is declining, and that's dangerous because when people lose faith in the system, they start looking for alternatives that can shake the very foundation of our democracy. And here's something most people don't realize. For the first time ever, millennials and Gen Z will make up the majority of eligible voters. They're the ones most impacted by issues like housing, government debt, and climate change, but they also tend to vote in much lower numbers. So if they show up this election, they could completely reshape the outcome. So now let's take an in depth look at who the main candidates are and what specific policies they are proposing. We'll start with the party that's been in power since 2015, and that is the Liberals, who are led by Justin Trudeau for a long time. They came in promising hope and change, and for a while, it worked. They legalized cannabis, they implemented a carbon tax, and implemented the Canada Child Benefit. It was all a big bet on progressive policies, but after nearly a decade, that initial promise of hope has faded. The cost of living crisis and controversies like the weed charity scandal, invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time ever in response to the trucker protests, along with the rising public debt, have many voters asking whether it's time for a change. And with the recent threat of tariffs from the Trump administration, this has put one specific economic issue at the front and center, which is Canada's reliance on the United States as a trade partner. A key part of Canada's economy is its energy sector, and it's actually a big reason why GDP has stagnated over the past decade because oil prices were very high 10 years ago, so Canada's economy benefited, and Canada sends the vast majority of their oil imports to the United States. And then throughout the 2010s, advances in hydraulic manufacturing allowed the US to scale up their oil production to the point they became the world's largest oil producer, which meant there was less demand coming from them for Canadian oil. So while the US was booming with this new source of cheap energy, Canada, despite being a resource rich country, was getting left behind. Now, the solution to this problem would be to enhance Canada's energy infrastructure to allow exporting of oil to non US destinations like Europe or Asia. But many of these pipeline projects that would have done that got canceled under the Liberal government. It's part of the reason why we've seen this growing divide between the East and West provinces. Being environmentally conscious and blocking these new pipelines, it all sounds great unless you're the one who has to foot the bill for it, like many Western Canadians feel that they are. For example, there was the Keystone XL pipeline that was meant to deliver crude oil from Western Canada to refineries in the US Gulf Coast, where it could then be shipped globally. But this project never came to fruition, and it wasn't entirely the Liberal government's fault. It was really more to do with decisions made by the Biden administration in the United States. But then there was also the Northern Gateway pipeline canceled in 2016 that would have shipped oil to the BC coast for export into Asia. And this project was canceled due to its environmental impact. And then there was also Energy East, which would have sent oil all the way to New Brunswick, giving Canada direct access to international markets. But this was canceled in 2017, also citing environmental concerns. A key policy that really defined the Trudeau era was the carbon tax, which was a tax on carbon emissions designed to push people and businesses towards cleaner energy alternatives. And initially, it worked. Emissions were cut modestly, although it is difficult to isolate whether this was due to the carbon tax or other factors such as the lockdowns of 2020, which would have lowered emissions regardless of whether or not the carbon tax was in place, but a study done by Clean Energy Canada suggested it did help stop emissions from further increasing, even if it didn't necessarily cause them to decrease drastically just in the few years after it was implemented. And because the money collected from this tax is redistributed back to Canadians, some Canadians actually came out ahead. But here's the flip side: it does hit Western and rural Canadians harder since they rely more on driving and natural gas. And then, because inflation started to become a problem toward the end of Trudeau's tenure, the carbon tax became a political weapon that could be blamed for this inflation that was hurting millions of Canadians. But in reality, inflation was caused by much greater factors like supply chain disruptions and higher energy prices that would have happened regardless of the carbon tax, and eliminating it wouldn't have lowered inflation really by a noticeable amount, which is why many other countries had similar levels of inflation as Canada did, even if they don't have a carbon tax. But regardless of the carbon tax, the economic record under Trudeau's cabinet was extremely poor, which is ultimately what caused frustration in so many Canadians. Housing prices continued to climb higher and further out of reach for average people, and Canada's most populated cities became far too expensive to live in. And Canada's national debt continued to soar higher due to higher government spending. So once it became clear that the Liberal Party really had no chance of being reelected with Trudeau as their leader, he was forced to resign and he was replaced by the current Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Now, Carney isn't your typical political figure. He's not a career politician. He's a global economist with one of the most impressive resumes in the world. Born in the Northwest Territories, Carney earned degrees from Harvard and Oxford and then spent over a decade at Goldman Sachs. And in 2008, during the global financial crisis, he was the governor of the Bank of Canada, and his leadership during such a severe economic downturn earned him a lot of praise at the time. And then came something very unusual. He was called to be the head of the Bank of England, becoming the first foreigner to ever do so. But more recently, Carney's been a key figure in global climate finance through his role at Brookfield Asset Management, where he's been pushing banks and investors to start taking climate risk more seriously. Now, he stated that he does believe in a free market system, but that system can disregard the environment, so governments must step in and change that. He published a book called Values, where he argues the nature of capitalism is self destructive. And he says capitalism has to evolve to where values like sustainability and economic equality become integral to economic decision making. So, to some, he's a level headed expert leader, but to others, he's an elitist who's out of touch with everyday Canadians. And if he does become prime minister, what we can expect is a technocratic leader, someone who trusts institutions and believes strongly in climate action, but also someone that can see Canada's role through an economic lens. And since taking over the Liberal Party, he's ensured a far more competitive election. If we look at the polling just at the beginning of this year, before Carney took over, the Conservative Party was virtually guaranteed a victory. But now the Liberals are actually in the lead, and by a sizable margin. So, in a moment when confidence in the Liberal Party as a whole was pretty much all but gone, Carney offered the image of competence and credibility. But his arrival doesn't guarantee smooth sailing because while he's given a new hope to a party that's already been in power for 10 plus years, Pierre Poilievre is gaining support with voters who feel left behind. He's really built a brand around economic frustration and personal freedom. He talks about bringing home affordability and cracking down on bureaucracy and giving Canadians back control of their lives. To some, he's a straight shooter who's finally speaking the truth, but to others, he's just further dividing the country and oversimplifying complex problems. Now, to understand why he struck such a nerve in Canadian politics, you have to go back to where he came from. Polyev was adopted at birth and raised in Calgary by two school teachers. He studied international relations at the University of Calgary, a place that is known to be more conservative leaning, and in Alberta in general, there's been a deep rooted sense of Western alienation, the idea that federal policies often ignore the interests of the West and are run by provinces like Ontario and Quebec. At just 25 years old, he was elected as a Conservative MP under Stephen Harper, and over the next decade, he built a reputation as one of the party's most combative members, sharp, relentless, and a very strong online presence. So now let's dig into the platforms of the two main parties. Of course, there are other players like the NDP, the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, and the Green Party, though their influence tends to be more regional or issue specific. Now, it's been an interesting campaign thus far, since Trump's tariff threats have really stolen the spotlight and changed what the most important issues are for this election. Trade relations with the US is now the second most important issue. And it's hard to argue against Carney being the better candidate for this, since he's got the much better resume at managing economies through financial downturns, and clearly most Canadians agree, since the Liberals are favored on this particular issue. But this issue is about more than just tariffs. It really exposes a much bigger issue, which is that Canada needs to diversify their trading partners away from just the US. And both parties seem to understand this. Carney has specifically said that this would be a goal of his should he be reelected, but we don't really have specifics on what this would look like, since it's still a developing situation. And Poilievre's response to this has been to emphasize something he was already planning to do, which was to ensure pipelines can be built to get Canada's energy to international destinations. And he's also said that he supports targeted reciprocal tariffs against the US and is willing to renegotiate the US CMA, but will not concede on certain areas like the auto industry or the dairy market. But let's move on to other issues that have been around for much longer. And for this, I want to focus on three key issues, which are housing, immigration, and climate action. And let's start with housing, since this is a big one and it's been a big issue for many election cycles now. If you're a young Canadian trying to buy a home or even just rent, you probably feel like the system's rigged against you. And honestly, you're not wrong. There's many reasons why this housing problem has not only persisted, but progressively gotten worse over the years. And it's now been estimated that Canada needs to build 3.5 million new housing units by the year 2030 to address affordability issues. And considering that Canada is currently doing about 250,000 housing starts per year, we're still a ways off. So, who actually has a plan to fix the housing crisis? Well, we'll start with the Liberals' plan. Carney wants to create a whole new government entity called Build Canada Homes that would, in essence, act as one big developer. It would provide $25 billion of debt financing to prefabricated home builders and 10 billion of financing to affordable home builders, and also issue bulk orders to manufacturers of these prefabricated homes to ensure there is sustained demand throughout the year, which would also, in theory, support job growth in the skilled trades. Now, here's where it gets interesting. He's also proposed reintroducing a tax incentive from the 1970s for developers that build rental housing units called MURB, or multiple unit rental building. Basically, it allows these developers to deduct depreciation on the property at an accelerated rate, which reduces their taxable income and makes building this kind of housing more attractive from a investment standpoint. But Canadians are rightly skeptical of this plan because the Liberals have had a decade to fix this and they simply have not delivered. Now, arguably, the biggest factor in addressing the housing crisis is to work with municipalities because housing isn't solely a federal issue, and things like outdated zoning laws and long permit approval times, the so called red tape, are really what constrains supply from being built. Now, the Liberals did previously introduce the Housing Accelerator Fund to address this, and Carney is proposing some enhancements to this, like publicly reporting on municipalities' progress and speeding up approvals. And it really shows what the Liberals' philosophy is regarding housing, which is to use money and incentives to nudge municipalities towards reform while still respecting their local authority. But Polyev has elected to take a different approach. His core messaging around housing has been one thing: get the government out of the way, and his plan would tie federal funding to municipalities based on how much new housing they actually build, rewarding the builders who exceed their targets with bonuses, and punishing who he calls gatekeepers that stall development by withholding federal funding until they can meet their targets. So his goal is simple: rip through the red tape, build homes fast, and let market forces do the rest. Now, the one key criticism that this is drawn is that it could end up punishing certain cities too much. Even if you forced every city to approve more homes and build more homes, not all of them have the same capacity to build fast. Some are limited by geography, others by aging infrastructure, and in many places, there simply aren't enough skilled workers. Which brings us to our next issue, which is immigration. Canada is bringing in a record number of newcomers, and while immigration is critical to our economy and both parties support some level of immigration, it's also putting added pressure on housing, on healthcare, and on public services, especially when the pace of infrastructure can't keep up. up. The Liberals have already cut back on immigration by placing a cap on it, and Mark Carney has stated that he wants to keep this cap in place. Now, the Conservatives also support immigration, but with a key difference. Poilievre says the system needs to be better planned and not just bigger. So he's called for tying Canada's population growth to a level that's below the number of new housing units built and also considers factors like the availability of healthcare. So, in other words, ensuring newcomers can actually succeed when they arrive and not just be stuck in long wait lists and cramped apartments. Immigration was once a top issue in Canada, but it has since taken a back seat to things like the cost of living, trade relations, and housing. Another issue that is typically overshadowed due to it being a less immediate threat to Canadians is climate action. Now, the debate around climate action seems to follow one key theme: how fast should we move? And what costs are we willing to bear in order to reach net zero? And Canada has set a goal to reach net zero by the year 2050, which means no greenhouse gas emissions for all of Canada. Now, this is an especially tricky issue for Canada because we are such a resource based economy, and getting resources out of the ground and transporting them typically means emitting a lot of CO2. Now, since Carney took office, one of his biggest moves was to remove the consumer carbon tax. Now, he didn't do this because he doesn't believe in carbon pricing. It was more because the tax had become too controversial and removing it would undermine a key theme of Poilievre's campaign. However, the industrial carbon tax is still in place, which is much more impactful since large industrial emitters make up a much more significant chunk of emissions. As we can see here, the oil and gas sector is still the biggest contributor to emissions in Canada. There is strong evidence that carbon pricing does work. So, what Carney wants to do is align the interests of the private sector with the government's goals. So, things like tightening the output based pricing system for those large industrial emitters. So, in essence, force them to cut emissions more aggressively, and also develop a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which you can think of like a tariff on imports based on their carbon content. And this addresses a key issue, which is if Canada's climate policies become too strict, and other countries are more lenient, it could undermine their competitiveness and hurt the economy or force these companies out of Canada entirely. Now, the Conservative Party wants to repeal all forms of carbon pricing at the federal level, including the one on large industrial emitters, and instead incentivize the development of clean energy through things like funding programs and tax incentives. They believe that Canada, being a resource driven economy, should bet more on innovation and technology to reach their net zero goals rather than using taxation. Now, to be crystal clear, provinces would still have the authority to implement their own carbon pricing systems, and many of them do currently have that. This federal backstop on the large industrial emitters actually only applies to Manitoba, Nunavut, PEI, and the Yukon. Now, he's also said that he'd prioritize approving phase two of LNG Canada, which would be Canada's first liquid natural gas export terminal. It's expected to be completed later this year, and it would supply LNG to Asia and help diversify Canada's trading partners away from just the US, which we now know is very important. The downside is that this project would mean reaching net zero for Canada becomes much more difficult. Even though LNG production does emit less CO2 than the oil sands does, it's been estimated that this project would emit 4 additional megatons of greenhouse gas annually, which is equivalent of putting 850,000 cars on the road. And this is why there's some worries about this project under a Liberal government, since they seem much more committed to net zero, even if that means sacrificing some economic independence. So again, LNG Canada highlights that debate about how much economic growth are we willing to sacrifice as a resource driven economy, which will be a front and center issue for this election and probably several in the future. So with that, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. I hope you did learn something new. If you did, then please leave a like. And if you're new to my channel, I'd appreciate it if you would consider subscribing. And let's hope that with whatever outcome we get with this election, it sets Canada back on the right track.